Ladies and gentlemen, signore e signori, welcome to this keynote speaker session of ESOF 2020 dedicated to the cities of the future and their challenge between climate change and pollution. Before we get started, let me welcome all people that are following the event on our online platform. I would like to introduce briefly the keynote speaker of the session. We have Dr. Oni Tolullah, epidemiologist of the University of Cambridge. We have Griša Močnik, professor at Joseph Stephan Institute. We have Mrs. Eugenie Molyneux, Chief Risk Officer of Commercial Insurance at Zurich Insurance Group. And finally, we have Ina Homeier, head of the Smart City Unit of the city of Vienna. We can move to the first speaker. We welcome Dr. Oni Tolullah, that she will speak about pollution and health, giving us stories from Europe and Africa, and also best practices around the world.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. I decided to adapt my talk a little bit, going first in this session and speak a little bit more from a systems perspective. So I'm going to be talking about emergency health foresight and thinking about the implications of that for policy and healthy policy and practice in the context of urbanization, which is very much a signifying trait of the 21st century. So first, if we take a global perspective on urbanization and health today, what we see, this first image just shows the changing trends of urbanization in different regions of the world between 2000 and 2050 projected. And what you can see is that certainly the highest rates of urbanization, both in terms of absolute and increase over time, is happening in Asia, and on the African continent, where it's starting from the quite low levels, we're seeing a rapid urbanization over time, with a lot less change happening in North America and Europe, and to a lesser extent South America. Put another way, I like this image because it graphically shows you how fast the cities are growing on a daily basis. So the numbers represent the number of people moving into the city per hour. And you can see, say, Lagos, you have 56 people moving city per hour, Delhi 75, Dhaka 60, Cairo 42, London by comparison about 10, Paris 7, Mexico City 24. So you get a sense of just really how dynamic these cities are. Why is this important for health? At this point, I want to introduce the planetary health context, because I don't think we can think about human health without taking into context the balance with the ecosystem and the environments that we depend upon and that we influence. So this is just a triangle showing that relationship between the environment, between the humans and the hosts, and between a contagion. And I said contagion in this context because that could be a pollutant, like an air or water. It could be a pathogen. And this essentially demonstrates that that relationship between a contagion in the environment and the risk of emergence of new diseases and exposure to diseases is very much influenced by activities of humans. The interaction between humans and the environment and the risk of transmission and ecological disruption is very much influenced by what pathogens and pollutants already exist. And similarly, even in the context of a contagion, the vulnerability to humankind is very much influenced by the environment in which we live, be that the food environment, the healthcare environment, etc. So that really shows the ways that urbanization and the more anthropogenic activities influence both the human health and the environment. So just to capture this another way of thinking about health inequality, we have a situation where we have urbanization driving disruption in ecology, pushing boundaries of human settlements that increase the risk of emergence of new diseases. We have urban settlements that are facilitating transmission. You know, in cities that are growing the fastest, we see a huge increase in dense informal settlements that we know increase transmission of infectious diseases, but also more susceptibility to non-communicable disease. We see an increase of vulnerability to disease through unequal exposure to unhealthy environments, inadequate urban infrastructure, and particularly concerning, given the life course, increasing exposure of young people to unhealthy cities. Against this context, we also have an inequitable access to care. So this is just a framing of understanding why, when we talk about addressing health challenges, we can't not address the urban challenge. So we really need to rethink health, and really tied into that is reimagining the urban. Why rethink? Well, I hope the first couple of slides have convinced you, but we can't afford to react. So we know that there's a significant impact of the high disease burden on economic development. For example, just looking at outdoor air pollution alone in the African region context, the estimated economic cost of that is over $400 billion US. So we cannot afford to focus solely on treating ourselves through an epidemic, through a high burden of disease. And this sounds obvious, but I have had in a scientific space someone say to me that, you know, Africa has far too many health challenges right now, so we can't afford to be thinking long term and thinking about prevention. This is in a scientific environment. We really need to think differently. We also can't afford to have this siloed health systems that focus solely or largely on acute episodic care, given that we know that many of the factors that influence disease lie outside of the healthcare sector. So what does rethinking health start to look like? Well, when we think about health services, we know that there are services that we need to be that inform exposure, that determine intermediate and long-term health outcomes. We often think about that in the context of healthcare, be that preventative healthcare or for treatment or for palliation, looking at access to that service and how that impacts disease control and mortality and morbidity in the long term. But what if we looked at it a little bit differently? What if we thought about human settlements as a health service and thought about the exposures that result, what we know already about the ways that these exposures relate to intermediate and long-term health outcomes? What if we thought about transport or waste or food as health services? You can see, for example, air pollution and greenhouse emissions cuts across practically all of these health services, having significant implications for both human health and climate change. So this is just a completely a rethink in things. So can we start asking different questions like, can urban services and exposures be harnessed to positively influence health? And if so, by whom? So I'm trying to paint the picture of what is actually a planetary health emergency, and we talk about pollution as if we can afford to talk about it slowly. This graph from the OECD in Africa, for the African continent, that shows that air pollution contributes more to premature deaths than more commonly recognized risk factors like unsafe water, unsafe sanitation, or childhood malnutrition. If we let that sink in for a moment, we can start to get a sense of why this is a critical emergency. And this is not just in the African region, so this is obviously a huge continent. It's important to point out that pollution is directly linked to poverty and deprivation, and you have unequal access to that here. I live in London, and we can have overall measures of air quality that might fit within the EU standards, but if we go below, at a lower level, we have parts of London that exceed by several fold the air quality, and we see that manifest particularly in context of like childhood asthma, hospitalizations, etc. Despite this, going back to the African region, we know that a tiny amount of children in Africa reside within 50 kilometers of air monitoring stations that measure air pollution. The reality is we can't address what we don't measure, and we need to focus on measuring what we value. So here's some hard truths about why we may not act in the face of what is a clear emergency. We have biases in terms of our risk perception. So when causes and effects are not side by side, when we can carry on as normal, or when we can other the consequences. So this is not to do with us, this is happening over there. We're less likely to act. We're more likely to act when the ask is clear and finite, when we don't need to change too much, and when the action and the beneficial effect can be directly attributed to the responder. But you can start to see with something like pollution and health, where you don't have the cause and effect side by side often. So you have the exposure resulting in disease, not immediately, but over time. There is that time disconnect. There's also a spatial disconnect because it travels over space. There is sectoral disconnect because the sectors responsible for pollution are not linked to the sectors that see the health impacts of the pollution. So we really need to start resuscitating our imagination and thinking about how can we integrate health and resilience into emergency action in this context. This is just a provocation to center us on the SDGs, and we talk about different Sustainable Development Goals. I actually put this together without thinking about the SDGs and retrospectively try to match the SDGs to see whether they're all represented. And apart from migration, which isn't so clearly represented in the SDGs, all aspects were covered there. And this is essentially showing the link between what we talk about as health, which is actually just a bit at the end, be that disease or risk behaviors and exposures. But that is really just the tip of the iceberg. And in order to address that, we need to start looking further upstream and looking at those resilience factors, things like the pollution and injury, that's air pollution, waste pollution, that impact our ability to be resilient, and even further upstream to look at the environments that drive those exposures. Not from an academic understanding, but from a proactive, what can we do about it? So when we start talking about improving health, we don't forget what we know, which is this, and we don't just solely focus on reactive disease management, but we start thinking differently about governance for health and thinking about who within the city should be accountable for health. So just wrapping up, seeing that these require more systems-based. I'm afraid there's no way of simplifying. Well, it's not complicated, but it is complex, and we do have to engage with that complexity because we otherwise risk causing unintended consequences. It requires coordinated urban intelligence. It requires intersectoral collaboration. It requires thinking about health and resilience upfront as a performance indicator across urban sectors. And it requires that integrated measurement for greater accountability. This was a couple of provoking pieces I wrote to think about thinking differently, because if we want bolder action, we have to start with bolder thinking. So, induced by the COVID pandemic, I thought about what would a Marshall Plan for planetary health in cities, in Africa and across the world look like? How can we think differently about emergencies? How can we internalize the preventable natures either of a particular emergency or of the downstream impacts of that and mitigate that? How do we act differently? How do we learn from what we know now? In other words, how can we address the systemic drivers of those preventable and prevent the preventable, as it were? This is supposed to be messy, because if we start looking at mapping, well, what would the systems for health in the context of COVID look like? I left it messy because, so the blue shows known associations is between urban infrastructure services, exposure, behaviors, and health and environmental challenges and emergencies. Orange represents transmission factors, and this lighter blue are modifiable vulnerability factors. So if we just take the example of an emerging, a new infection like COVID, based on what we know about some of the vulnerability factors like respiratory disease, like heart disease and diabetes, like obesity, if we start thinking about what would it look like to be more resilient to that in the context, and what has got to do with cities? We can very quickly see that the behaviors and experiences that are required to modify vulnerability are directly linked to aspects, to exposures in the urban environment, one of which is the healthcare system, but really around connectedness and space, around housing, around air pollution. And very quickly we start thinking differently about, so if we had to start from left to right and do this again, who should be around the table in making a city resilient against an emergent new infection? In other words, borrowing from the epidemiological language that we've been using in the context of treating and addressing the implications of COVID, can we think about flattening a curve, but in the long term, not just flattening the curve to increase capacity of health systems to deal with emergencies, but actually can we flatten, can we reduce, lower the healthcare need by addressing these pollutants in the environment? Can we vaccinate people with life-supporting environments, like I showed with the integrated governance of risk? And modeling, there's been a lot of thinking about and talk about epidemiological models, mathematical models, but we often forget the values models of shared purpose, because in all of this, the systems approach means that we will have to prioritize, and that priority is very much driven by what we value, and that needs to be a lot more explicit and a lot more connected to how we allocate funds and how we keep sectors, individuals, organizations accountable. But in order to do this, we need to remember that resilience is not an endpoint, because a lot of the shocks and stressors that drive these protracted health emergencies stem from unintentional choices. We need to tackle that problem blindness I mentioned earlier, because when you have this disconnect between the where the exposure lies and where the health outcome lies. We don't see the problem often. So, for example, we see that in the context of urban development and hospitalizations from asthma and heart disease that are really exacerbated by air pollution, damp environments, and inability to be physically active safely outdoors, related to air pollution as well. And lastly, and importantly, the finance side of things, addressing that wrong pocket problem, because we know that investing then in health is more than just investing in healthcare, because we need financing that addresses its exposures in order to result in better health outcomes down the line. So this is just an example. I'm going to leave you with one tangible thing that's happened. So in the African context, two things that we know. It's obviously a very diverse continent with many countries, but two things that are common are the rate of urbanization, so we're urban and urbanizing, and the youth. So the median population age is just over 20, but we have a situation where urbanization goals are not aligned to address health and sustainability, and we have a situation where youth are increasingly exposed to this polluted environment. But so whilst they're important target and vulnerable population, they're also important agents of change. And we know, so there was a recent youth survey that filled me with a lot of hope, that found, compared to other regions, a rising optimism amongst youth, driven by the sense of responsibility, entrepreneurship and confidence in African emergency. And the critical factor would be then, how do we harness this hope to drive an increased demand for healthy places, but also an increased supply of health from place. I don't know how long we've been going, but I feel like it's been going so long enough. So I'll just leave you with this last slide, which is one of the ways that we're working on doing that at the moment. So 7th of September is the first United Nations International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. And as part of this, we're working with UNEP and a couple of organizations to engage youth across the continent to show us what is being done, what the state of affairs is, what they think needs to be done, and to really harness their creativity to drive that demand for change. So I'll leave you there. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tolullah. We are running out of time, so I will be quick. We move to the next speaker, Professor Močnik, professor at Joseph Stefan Institute. He will talk to us about the importance of measurement systems and innovation in measurement of air pollution.
Thank you very much for the ability to present. I'll be doing all of the talking because Matevž is on an airplane. We have an ongoing airplane measurement campaign. So here we go. I'll connect the air quality, which is a local phenomenon, with climate change, which is a global phenomenon, and I'll close with how smart the cities can be. And this is not my work alone. There's a lot of people who were involved in this. And what we measure in air are the emission of different sources which are mixed into the atmosphere in very complex ways. And when we determine the sources, we want to separate the traffic from the, for instance, biomass burning emissions and the industrial emissions. And this mixture is what we breathe. And it's not a local phenomenon alone, it's also a regional phenomenon. This is a picture I took from an airplane over India, and we see very small sources of air pollution that have regional effects. So this biomass burning, which is clearing of the fields, covers all of the Indo-Gangetic plain. And black carbon, which is the soot that we see in the emissions from the tailpipe, for instance, has a very important climate effect. I'll compare it with carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide heats at the surface because it absorbs the infrared radiation from the warm Earth, and it hits the atmosphere with a total effect of about 1.6 watts per square meter in terms of the direct radiative efficiency. Black carbon, which are small black particles in the atmosphere, which absorb sunlight, hits the atmosphere because it absorbs sunlight, but it cools the surface. And the net effect is about 2/3 of that of carbon dioxide. When we take into account also indirect effects, we come to a number of about 1.1 watt per square meter with a very large uncertainty. And this uncertainty needs to be reduced using measurements. And the reason why this is important, because these numbers then go into the models, and the different models show us how we can reduce the heating relative to the measurements that were taken in the past, and then we project this into the future. And we see that different scenarios reduce the heating differently relative to doing nothing. And if we take into account all of the measures relating to the carbon dioxide emissions and all of the measures relating to black carbon and methane emissions, we slow the heating and we reduce the heating in the long term below the 2-degree limit. With these abatement measures, which are geared toward the climate, we also get a very large health effect on the population. We see that we avoid more than 800,000 premature deaths in India alone, almost 700 in China. And so we have a win-win situation where the climate and the health effects of air pollution are combated at the same time. So black carbon emissions vary by orders of magnitude depending on the efficiency of combustion. And we need to measure this because on the local level, we are interested in the health effects of air pollution. On the regional level, this is a political question on the transport of air pollutants. And on the global effect, it's a climate effect that needs to be tackled fast. So on all these three different levels, we need to determine the state of the environment first. And then we use this information to validate our models, which are used to plan abatement. And these abatement actions are then implemented, and we use the measurements to measure the efficiency of the abatements. So we need to conduct measurements all of the time. And on the local scale, we are measuring air pollution due to traffic, usually. And I'll show an example from Ljubljana, because it's my local city, and the effect is drastic. Ljubljana is a city of about 250,000 people, with about 350,000 people in the broader regions, including the city. And the municipality has closed 0.5 kilometer of the major street through the city center. And this is marked on the map. Most of the traffic was expected to be diverted to this road around the city center, and to measure this, we have put in place 3 different measurement stations, one next to the closure of the street, one next to the street where the city expected the traffic to be diverted to, and one measuring the background far away from the sources, the direct sources of air pollution. And at the background, we see very similar changes in black carbon concentration during the day. So we go from midnight to noon to midnight, we see the morning peak, and before the closure and after the closure, there is an increase of concentrations because this has happened in the fall and the weather has changed, so we have different meteorological conditions before and after. So what we are interested in is the change relative to this background. When we look at the bypass, we also see an increase. We see the morning peak due to traffic. We see the evening peak. But the situation is similar, nothing special happens. At the site of the closure, we see a drastic reduction of concentrations, and we see an almost complete elimination of this midday peak, which was related to people driving back home from work. So looking at the difference between these two sites where we expect changes in air pollution and the background site, so we look at the difference between the center bypass station and the background, and we look at the difference between the closure site and the background. So this is the local contribution in terms of a specific site inside the city relative to the background. We see that before the closure, this difference was relatively large at the traffic side and slightly smaller at the background side. And then when we compare this after the closure, we see no change in the bypass and a 70% reduction of local air pollution at the closure site. So the take-home message of this municipal intervention is that the radical measures result in radical improvement of air quality, which improves the quality of life. When we go to the regional scale, I'm showing here winter campaign results which we have conducted in Paris, and we have separated the traffic emissions from biomass burning emissions, because biomass burning is just as important as traffic in terms of urban air pollution. We had one measurement site south of Paris, and here we see the pollution due to traffic, which is mainly local, centered around traffic, some pollution coming from the south, some pollution coming from the northwest. This is contrasted by the biomass burning contribution, which is measured here, which comes from the northeast and mainly from the neighboring countries. So what we see here is that at a specific suburban site close south of Paris, we have a completely different situation when we need to manage the traffic emissions and the biomass burning emissions. The abatement goals for traffic emissions can be managed by local intervention, and the biomass burning emissions need to be managed internationally. And this brings us to the global picture, where we measure the climate change. And climate change we measured with very small airplanes. This is the measurement platform. We have measured taking air at the inlet under the wing, and the instruments were inside the cabin. And we saw these layers of carbonaceous aerosol, of carbon-containing particles in the air. This is a layer above Malaysia due to burning of the tropical forests. And this is a layer over the Congo River, also due to large-scale burning, mainly of savanna, which is then transported over long-range distances. So these layers remain in the atmosphere for a few weeks, and they heat the atmosphere. And this is not the only source. We also have cities. This is Barcelona. We see a layer of very polluted air because the city is the source of air pollution. And these cities are continuing to be built. This is a very large city being built close to Cairo, which is also a mega city with a lot of air pollution. And building large infrastructural, centralized buildings which require a lot of power generation for air conditioning might not be the best solution. The results of our global measurement campaigns, this is the flight with the airplane around the world in 2012, we have identified regions of interest. So this is the dust and biomass burning outflow from Western Africa, the Amazon basin, the coast of the Mexican Gulf, burning of tropical forests in Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Central Africa, Then when we have conducted similar measurements in 2016, we have seen that not much has changed. We still have very polluted Central Europe, the outflow from Western Africa, the very high concentrations around the Gulf of Mexico and in the Indian continent, subcontinent and Middle East. So to conclude, we need to ask ourselves, how smart can the cities be? And in terms of this, we need to make a very strong statement that smart cities are not related just to traffic. Managing traffic is the easiest intervention, but it does not necessarily address the most important source of air pollution, which impacts the health of the urban population. For instance, heating and all aspects of energy production need to be addressed centrally in a smart city. And it's not just the urban activities which are important, because energy production which is consumed inside the city is generated away from the city. So the bottom line is that we need to consume less energy. We need to consume less, essentially, roads. We need to travel differently. And the really important thing is that cities will be as smart as the regulators and the inhabitants of the cities will be, because the regulators set the context of the smart cities, and the inhabitants are the ones which essentially through their action make the city smart. And if we take into account all of the very successful interventions from the past, like the Convention on Long-Range Transport of Air Pollutants, which has eliminated sulfur from the air starting in the 1980s. The elimination of fluorinated hydrocarbons, which has stopped the destruction of the ozone layer. All of this starts from an international agreement, which then the national and local regulators pick up and implement on a local and regional level. And this is the context of the improvements that we need to enact now. With this, I'll stop. Thanks a lot, and we'll have a lively discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Močnik. I would like now to introduce the next speaker, that is Mrs. Eugenie Molyneux, Chief Risk Officer at Zurich Insurance. Mrs. Molyneux will give us a real example of a risk assessment for the cities of the future in the climate change era.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate risk and how our customers have to manage that to contribute to a lower carbon economy for the future. So if we just start with, well, what does the risk landscape look like? And obviously this year that risk landscape has become more complex. You know, we're in a healthcare crisis that's also an economic crisis. If you add to that the geopolitical risk landscape, then the list of risks for our customers to manage is lengthy, including climate change. It's not just lengthy, it's also interconnected. That means a balance has to be struck between when mitigating these risks, so that solving one doesn't exacerbate the risk of another. Including some of the health risks that we saw referred to earlier. So normally when we survey, shall we say, risk managers around the world or corporate leaders around the world, actually normally what you find is climate risks are normally in the top of their concerns. They perceive climate risks to be significant to their business. What's very interesting is that early this year, but post the impact of COVID-19, we conducted another survey. And what we found, unfortunately, was that landscape of perceived risks changed. So we surveyed senior risk professionals across three categories. The first one is, what were the risks that were most likely for the world? What were the risks that were of the greatest concern for the world? And what were the risks that were most worrisome for companies? So, if you look at the right-hand column, essentially that column represents what our customers think is their risk landscape that they are dealing with. And what's notable about that list is that when you look at it, what you can see is that in the top 7 risks that they're quoting, it's dominated by economic risks, cyber, geopolitical risks are in there. But what's also notable is climate change isn't on the list. So essentially it's gone from being right at the top of people's concerns and usually dominating the top concerns to sort of falling out of the top concerns. So in that survey, only 18% of respondents identified a shortfall of investment for climate action as one of the most likely risk outcomes, and only 16% considered it most concerning. So you could interpret this positively or negatively. If in a positive interpretation, it may well be that our customers and the senior risk managers of the large companies around the world feel that the world will uphold its commitment to mitigating climate change. That's the positive outlook. The more negative outlook is that this has just dropped so far down the risk priority list for our customers that potentially we might see less action on climate change than we might have expected previously. In the meantime, in terms of how our customers are impacted by climate change, today, but also going forward, in recent years, of course, we've seen unprecedented storms, fires and floods. There's been major property, infrastructure and environmental damage, as well as loss of human life. But our customers, typically, they're running businesses and they're looking at the disruptions to the delivery of their goods and services, which has increased due to environmental disasters. And if I give you an example, in North America in 2017, in the automotive industry, only factory fires and mergers and acquisitions caused more supply chain disruptions than hurricanes. So our customers are being impacted today, not in the future, now, by increasingly extreme weather events. And that's what they're interested in managing typically. So if you look on the right-hand side, the damage to the properties, the disruption to the delivery of their goods and services, but also the disruption of their supply chains. What's interesting about that is those are their direct risks. There are some indirect risks to their business as well, which is if their workforce are harmed or otherwise impacted, and if infrastructure fails. So what we find is typically companies will focus on the direct first, but then they'll work their way to considering the risks posed by those other indirect risks. Now, through Zurich's Flood Resilience Alliance, what we've demonstrated is that investing $1 in prevention can save you $5 in recovery costs. But the problem is the most of the funding is actually post-event recovery related. So essentially what we probably need to be doing is spending more money on pre-event mitigation. Now, in addition to the Flood Resilience Alliance, at Zurich we've conducted a number of what we would call post-event review capability surveys. So this is where we look at some of the major catastrophe events around the world, and we basically do a lessons learned. And that study will focus on the resilience of people, of supply chain systems, cultures, both during the disaster and after the disaster. And what we've observed from reviewing 13 major events is that disaster risk management is playing catch-up to increasingly larger exposures. Moreover, and I mentioned this to some extent, globally, spending on response is far greater than the spending on pre-event mitigation. Additionally, where infrastructure is in place, so it could be levees, for example, sometimes that can produce a false sense of security, because of course those have probably been built with the historical level of events in mind and not necessarily updated. So the problem is people can feel that they're protected, and when in actuality the events are getting worse and the protection is insufficient. And lastly, there are not enough incentives to build back better. So often what you find is people are building back to the same level and not stronger and better. So from a risk management perspective, when we talk about managing climate risks, when we talk to our customers about managing climate risks, we believe that it is key for our customers to focus on the management of the risks in relation to climate change, so not just drop it down the priority list and off the page, and in doing so improve their own resilience. The risk management approach to climate change isn't much different to the risk management approach for any other risk that we face. You know, broadly, it starts with identifying the risks, usually at a broad business or strategic level, and in particular in relation to climate change, but again, applicable elsewhere, we'd recommend developing scenarios. So this might be where instead of you looking at the impact of, say, a 2-metre flood level, you might do a scenario around a 10-metre flood level and look at the impacts to your business of that. Then step 2 is that you develop a granular level of the risks involved. So what do we mean by that? That means you assess, for example, individual locations. You do a quantitative and qualitative risk assessment of those locations, and in doing so, you prioritise where you're going to spend your mitigation efforts. And in doing that risk assessment, like you've just heard me say quantitative and qualitative, and I found it interesting earlier, the reference to including values as one of the criteria. That's very much the case. It can't just be, it's not, for our customers, it shouldn't just be a monetary consideration. And it should include criteria such as a value-based criteria. So E, S and G criteria are important when doing your risk assessment. While you're developing that granular risk view, this is somewhere where we as insurers can help our customers. Because of course, one of the things that we do is take some of the scientific projections, say from the IPCC, and we translate those into peril region assessments for our catastrophe models. So our catastrophe models can play a role in helping customers assess those risks. However, much like some of the limitations described earlier, unfortunately, those limitations then translate directly into our CAT models, catastrophe models. So it's important to acknowledge that, and that's where the scenarios become important, because it can help mitigate, shall we say, the reliance on a single number. Then the third step is obviously to develop a mitigation strategy. I would argue that the more critical piece, however, is actually acting upon it. Now, when you develop a mitigation strategy, again, this is where we come into play for our customers. It's where our approach is, so they need an integrated approach, yeah? They need to both be resilient, but they may also need insurance. But just to rely on insurance alone probably strategically isn't a good idea. So they do need an integrated approach with both pieces. Coming back to the post-event reviews that I referred to earlier, those had lessons more broadly for communities and governments, but they also had lessons for our customers. And similarly, as we noted that perhaps there should be more pre-event spending on mitigation, that is true both for the broader communities and governments, but also true for our customers specifically. Also for our customers specifically is for them to understand their high-value supply chains, because it's not just about their location, it's also about the locations of their suppliers and any interconnected risks with that. So it's not just about, as I said, the physical risk. You know, it could be infrastructure risk, it could be people risk. Also, we found that our customers should be stressing the preparedness of their employees, not just at work, but also at home. The more resilient they are, the more resilient the community is and the business is. This is going to sound circular, but we'd also recommend that if they have an event, they conduct a post-event review. And it's interesting because we have a very specific example of one customer who had a plant on a river in Germany. The river flooded. They did do a post-event review. And as a consequence of that post-event review, they built back better. So they put more protections in place. And what happened was that river flooded again. And the next time it flooded, they took no loss. So while it might sound circular, it's important. The last piece that I personally feel is quite critical when addressing climate change and getting people to act on it, I think, is to combat bias. We're living in a world where opinions can drown out facts. So in that world, biases are particularly difficult to overcome. And we've seen that during COVID-19 that sometimes the biases can develop faster than science does. And the problem is, therefore, science is ignored as a consequence. So as a community, we can do all the calculations that we want, but we may not get through to people for them to act on it. So in order to combat that, shall we say, world of opinions, what we probably need to be doing is increasing the messaging. We've got to find a way to articulate to people what climate change means for them. What are the impacts to them specifically? And that way you'll hook people in. But that messaging needs to be given early on so that people don't suffer from a bias to, believing what they heard first. And it needs to be, that communication needs to be constant. The last piece on bias is, in terms of combating bias, data can be useful, but it can also be problematic. So ideally, we would live in a world of making data-driven decisions. The one issue that we do have with climate change is that the past does not reflect the present or the future. And so the problem is we just need to make sure that the data that we're using doesn't create the red herring. If we're doing forward-looking projections and we can help people understand those and the impacts that those represent to their businesses, we stand a chance. Otherwise, the issue is that we'll see people will just look to the past. We have a customer, for example, who had the roof of their building blew off. They have a building in an earthquake zone in Italy, and they built the building to code. The problem is code is based on the historical level of wind events. And what happened was they experienced an extreme wind event. This was last year, and the roof built off. It disrupted their business. And so the problem is, what we need to do is to move people and businesses on from building to code, to building to a future projection. And that's what I mean by data can be a bit of a red herring. If you're sort of using sort of data to inform your code and then people are building to code, it can lead to the wrong answer. So in terms of my key takeaway message, I would suggest that to be successful at mitigating the risks emanating from climate change, we need to translate the science into the what does it mean for me message, and then communicate that message broadly and constantly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Molyneux. I would like to pass to the other, I would like to introduce the last speaker, Mrs. Ina Homeier, the head of the Smart City Unit at the City of Vienna. Mrs. Homeier will talk about the adaptation plan of the City of Vienna, that it's a good example in the European context. So we can introduce the next speaker. Posso magari, non so, faccio qualche domanda non so se posso. We are waiting for the last speaker, just a couple of minutes. Sì. No, no. I think that the staff are solving the problem, so we have just to wait some minutes. Okay. I would like to ask some questions to the three speakers that we have listened to. We can maybe start with Dr. Oni Tolullah. Dr. Tolullah, I would like to have a brief example of a city. You can decide. I prefer an example from Africa, because when we discussed on Skype the last week, you provide me a lot of stories from Africa in terms of smart city. Can you also provide these examples to our public, please?
So was that in the context of examples of this integrated approach?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I can give one example of some of the work that we're doing in Cape Town, for example, where, and it's not specific to air pollution, but in the context of the built environment, because you remember from my talk, I mentioned about the challenge of having this separation in these siloed sectors. So we actually got different sectors together from the government to the regional level to find out, well, firstly, and I like one of the things my other speakers said was like, find out what people value. You know, have a listen first before we start talking about what needs to happen, because we have to understand what people's priorities are, what drives people, and then to tap into that. So our first step was really bringing different sectors together, so not just health, but education and human settlements and transport and diverse sectors, to find out, well, strategically, what are your priorities? Because it's not true that everyone's trying to do a good job, right? And then the secondary question is, in what ways can those priorities be aligned to achieve health co-benefits? So through that process, we started a partnership with the Human Settlements Department, government department, who recognized, I mean, they came up and said, you know, we're here because we know what we do matters for health, but it's just not what we are mandated to do, right? So the question, so that was enough for me. So I thought, well, okay, let's just start there. What are you doing and what are your priorities? And we quickly identified one of the priorities around upgrading of informal settlements and the plans around that, and realizing that there was an opportunity, because that hadn't started yet, to think about, well, what are the indicators, what is driving the prioritization of what goes first in terms of the upgrades and where that goes? And could we look at health outcomes and health profiles as a way to drive that? So that was asking that first question. And some of the key challenges that came across very quickly were that data existed in very different spaces, right? And so we're all used to talking about how there are insufficient data, and that's true. There's a lot that we can do. I showed how we're not measuring air quality across the continent. But they are data, and where they exist in silos. So we started a project. Firstly, we conducted a qualitative review, in-depth interviews with different government workers to understand what their knowledge of determinants of health were, what their understanding of who played a role, what they could see as enablers and barriers to doing that. And then we designed what came afterwards based on that. So now we're in the process, for example, of merging those on one of the pilot sites where they were prioritizing the upgrading, to say, can we start off with this area of the city and integrate the health and human settlements data to understand where the hot spots of poor health lie, in ways that the environment, the built environment impact. And can we use that to influence where you go first and what parts of the package goes first? And so that is a very practical example of what colleagues of mine at Cambridge call practice-based research. So we always talk about evidence-based practice, but actually we need to do more of speaking to practitioners, engaging, and having that drive the research question to start off with.
Thank you so much. I would like to, I have a question also for Professor Močnik. So, starting from your experience, which are the open challenge in the measurement techniques that we have today for climate change and for emissions?
Thank you very much. I think that the main challenge in engaging these problems at all levels, this means local, regional, or global, is what Dr. Oni touched upon. It's, before you start, you need to engage all of the stakeholders to build a pre-action consensus. And this is challenging because the stakeholders have conflicts of interests, and resolving these conflicts of interest requires painfully long and patient action, and this depends, of course, on whether we are working on a local level, a regional level, or international, global level, and but we have examples from the past where action on all of these three levels has resulted in spectacular improvements of not just air quality, but people's lives. Quality of life has improved. And there are examples where this was a top-down approach, where international agreements have resulted in national laws which were implemented locally and air quality has improved, or bottom-up approaches where you have participative democracy that drives the change, where you go from local to global. And the local and the global effects are intertwined in a way where both of these top-down and bottom-up approaches can work if the action is planned well in advance and executed well. And there's a very frequent argument that we need to gather data before we act. We don't. Data is gathered. We have the data, and the data is very often publicly available. And essentially, we just need to get our acts together and start planning the actions and executing them. And this does not need to take a very long time.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have solved the problem. The staff has solved the problem. So I would like to introduce our last speaker, Ina Homeier, head of the Smart City Unit of Vienna. And Mrs. Homeier will talk us about the climate adaptation plan of the city.
Start already?
Mrs. Yeah, thank you.
Am I online now?
Yeah, you are on.
Okay, thank you very much. So you see, I'm talking about Smart City Wien, and as you realized, I had some technical problems, and it makes it very clear that Smart City Wien, the initiative, is not a digitalization technological-driven strategy. It is a clever strategy. Our initiative is about how to address climate change and energy efficiency and
Mrs. Homeier, we have some problem. We can hear you very well. Maybe can we try to solve the audio problem? It's not possible. It seems like impossible to solve the problem, so it's impossible to understand what you are saying. So I'm sorry, we have to stop your speech, because for the public it's impossible to understand.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, welcome. Okay.
So we have 20 minutes to go, so I would like to make a question to Mrs. Molyneux.
Yes.
Mrs. Molyneux, I have a question for you. You mentioned the importance of communication, and you mentioned the importance of local communication. We know that, in general, scientific literature in this context tell us that it's very important, but also very difficult to communicate at a local level. So, since you have a capillary network of agency, are you plan something in terms of communicate locally for climate change to engage people and citizens?
Yes, absolutely. So we understand that in our role as an insurer, we can help the transition to a low carbon economy. And part of that is around communication. Because part of what we can do, it's exactly what I said earlier, we take, shall we say, the scientific projections and we translate them into our catastrophe models. In doing so, what it allows us to do is to say to whether it's individual customers or business customers, this is what it means for you. Basically, we translate it into, is your house going to flood or not? Is your property going to flood or not? Is the roof going to blow off building again? So we absolutely see that as our role, and we play that role. Both, shall we say, at a global level with our large corporate customers, but also at a local level.
Yeah, and can I ask you in terms of insurance sector, generally speaking, do you think that insurance sector are ready to embrace this great challenge, or not all the companies are ready to embrace the challenge? What is your opinion?
I think the larger companies have embraced the challenge. Most of us have a climate policy. Most of us are doing climate reporting. So I would say certainly for the larger companies, which will then cover, shall we say, the majority of customers around the world, yes, I would say we have that. It's not to say it's all. And interestingly enough, coming back to what one of my colleagues said earlier, it is important, the regulatory environment, it is important, the context, I think, he said. I think it is important, the business context, because that does help.
Yeah, so I have a question for all the speakers. If we have no questions from the public, and I can't see any questions for the public, so I have a question for you. I would like to understand, what do you think in terms of open challenge that we have? Okay, we talk about pollution, we talk about health, and we talk about climate change. So in the COVID period, we saw that the emission goes down, and somehow was a good result of the pandemic, a good output of the pandemic. But what is the take-home message that we can bring from this sad period in terms of taking care of our world, our city, and also ourselves? I would like to have the opinion of all you three, so please, Dr. Tolullah, you can be the first.
Yes, I think the critical thing to take away from this difficult period is that we have for too long been limited by our mindset of impossibility. That determines everything. So we have a way of doing things like, that sounds great, but that's not how it's done. We need to do this first. This is the process. The pandemic has taught us or reminded us that we have set up these processes. However, when needed and when urgent, or certainly when perceived to be urgent, we don't have this processes. We're not servants to the processes, right? So then we make the change and the disruption needed to achieve the outcomes. So I think that's the critical thing that I take away from this, that our limitations is our mindset of impossibility. And I have got to a point of reframing a lot of the work that I've been doing as a societal reimagination, because we've lost our imagination somewhere along the way, just out of just sheer, maybe we're just tired, we've just been going at it for so long. And so the other aspect that I would take away from it, recognizing this, is the importance of youth. The most uplifting moments I've had over the last few months, almost to tears in a kind of good way, have been the ways in which engaging with be that people still at school, like at high school or at university, who were obviously at home, just the ways that they just started thinking about rethinking things. So just in that, just why do we have to do this? I had a first-year student in India say, well, I've just got an idea around reducing emissions, and he's learning theoretical physics, and there's just so many ideas, and we for too long we humor and we patronize youth, and we see that as it's a nice to have, look how intergenerational the dialogue is. One of the learnings is that, often, especially when it comes to moments of uncertainty, we don't know what to do because nobody does. And so imagination becomes critical. And so if we have to recognize where we don't have that imagination and bring in people who do, and the young people more naturally retain a strong sense of imagination.
So creativity has a solution. So.
Yes.
I would like to know the opinion of Professor Močnik.
Thank you. I think what the COVID emergency has taught us is that we need to take action immediately. And the response does not need to be picture perfect. We need to start doing, and then we can adapt as we learn more about the efficiency of the abatement measures. And we need to apply the lessons learned in the COVID emergency to the climate emergency. If the worst case scenario for COVID plays out this year, we'll have 1 million people, and compared to a climate emergency and air quality emergency where 7 million people die every year due to avoidable air quality problems, it's, this puts things in scale, and we seem to keep adding problems to our plate instead of doing something to find the solutions, and not just to find the solutions, but to actually carry out the work to improve things. And COVID has taught us that immediate action is possible.
Okay, so Mrs. Molyneux, I would like also to ask you the same question.
Yes, for me, the paradigm has shifted. We should take the positives away from that and adopt them more permanently. But I think the other element for me is that as we try to stimulate the economy due to coronavirus, it provides us with an opportunity to make one of the criteria in stimulating the economy around solving some of these issues we're talking about. So essentially we can translate what has been a difficult period and take the lessons and adopt them permanently both from just a approach perspective, but also from an economic opportunity perspective.
Okay, so I have another question, if you don't mind. I would like to know, we are at ESOF, so knowledge and research are our core. What about the gap between academia and industry? What if we fill this gap? What role it can be in this feeling for climate change, for pollution, and for health? What about an integration of academia into industry and vice versa? So what are your opinions, starting from Dr. Tolullah?
Thanks. So I think if we use the example of air pollution and air quality monitoring on the African continent, I think that's a great example of the importance of public and private partnership, because there is no way that at the speed needed, we're going to be able to get to the levels of monitoring that are needed. I mean, it's something like 6 or 7 countries out of the 54 that have active monitoring systems. I mean, so that is a clear need for partnership at that public-private level. Now, from an academic perspective, I think that really highlights the point I was making earlier about practice-driven research as well, because thinking about how we ask the questions, who we engage, needs to change. So if we're seeing that if the implementation of the findings requires this partnership, then we should be involving all the implementation partners at the beginning of the research process. So I think it's absolutely critical, because otherwise we do really good, solid research that then can't be implemented, that is not contextually relevant and doesn't have any buy-in. So I think it's really that co-design process, not just looking for partners to engage once we've got the findings, which is a very conventional and certainly out-of-date way of thinking about research.
Thank you. I would like to ask the same question to Professor Močnik.
Thanks. I'm biased. For a decade, I led a small high-tech company that developed and manufactures instruments to measure black carbon globally, and the data which is used globally to improve air quality is measured by those instruments. So, the partnership between the public and the private is already there, and we need to work on this, because improving air quality generates. We can frame this into a context where this generates revenue for small companies. It's not just about, during the improvement of quality of life, we can actually grow the economy. And this should be self-evident. And, the frameworks such as the European Union Green Deal, which is starting to be implemented, is the framework within which we need to start doing this. And the framework is ready to be implemented, and it's being implemented, and we need to step up and take advantage of this to try out things which we may think are impossible, but once we start implementing them, we might find ourselves surprised by how far can we go. And we should surpass our goals in terms of the climate because of our past inaction.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Mrs. Molyneux, can I ask you also your opinion?
Yes, so firstly I'd say I actually think as a company we engage a lot, whether that's, for example, with the European Union, OECD, so we will typically try to engage and give our views on developments. Moreover, we look constantly to broaden that engagement. So in other words, we look for additional opportunities, even to the extent of public-private partnerships. So it's not just then about sort of trying to have a discussion, but also to work together. So we actively look for those engagements. I don't think we're alone as a company doing that. So I think there are plenty of opportunities, and it's certainly something that we encourage at Zurich.
Okay, now we have our last 6 minutes, so it's time to take a message for you that are plenary speaker. Starting from Dr. Tolullah, I would like to have 1 minute and a half, like take a message for the public, please.
Thank you. I think the key take-home messages are that in order to improve health, human health and environmental health, we need to focus on both increasing the supply of health and the demand for health. And I say that in the context of cities, increasing the supply of healthy places and the demand for healthy places. That's the first thing. The second is that I would like cities and all actors that work within cities to see themselves very much in that framework. So as an individual, citizen, resident, how can I push to demand and increase the demand for healthy places and increase the demand for health from more than just healthcare? And as an organization, be that in the public or private sector, in what ways am I contributing to increasing the supply of health? That's the first thing. And I think the key take-home point, which speaks to my last point around, is really around youth. I think the cities and the countries that would be most successful at driving forwards planetary health and proactively engaging in putting our money where our mouth is in terms of the urgency and agency will be the cities and countries that meaningfully engage their youth. And so I put this as a call to action to countries to ask, well, in what ways are we engaging young? We have young academies in many countries across the world. There's a global young academy and there's national young academies of scientists that are driven and committed to science in service of society. In what ways are we engaging them? In what ways are we pulling in those who can reimagine, who are not shackled by what cannot be? So I think those would be the two take-home points. And I think if we can internalize that, we would go a long way towards achieving our sustainable development outcomes.
Thank you so much. Professor Močnik, I would like to have your take-home message for the public.
Sorry. Smart cities are part of the bottom-up approach to essentially improve air quality and stop climate change. And the cities are central to these improvements because this is where the density of population is greatest. We need to combine the short and the long-term effects of our abatement, because air quality can be improved in the short term, but climate action is intrinsically long term. And this is the difference between these two approaches, because while they do have clear co-benefits, the timeline is different. And we need to have some very fast, short-term solutions which improve air quality and quality of life in the cities, because we can build on these improvements to achieve the climate goals. And the infrastructure investments which are not necessary, like building new, larger roads, avoiding these investments can fund these actions locally at the municipalities. There's always a lack of funds, but avoiding investments that make problems worse can fund the abatement measures that will make our life better.
Thank you. Mrs. Molyneux, I would like to have your take-home message, please.
Yes. We cannot let some of the risks around health, pollution and climate change, for example, be deprioritised in favour of the economy or geopolitics. What we need to see this as is that addressing economic or geopolitical risks that we currently face provide opportunities for us to address these sustainability risks. As I said earlier, it's about balance in addressing the risks landscape. It's not foregoing one action on one risk for taking no action on another risk. That won't work. They're too interconnected, as I think we've demonstrated today. Achieving action, however, means drawing people in, and that's where the communication is key.
Okay, so we are finishing our time. I would like to thank you very much for your speech and for your contribution to this event. I would like also to thank you all the staff that provide me a lot of help. And also thank you all the public here in the auditorium and the public from the online platform. Nice to meet you and see you in the next event of EASOF.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.